Kennedy is ill. This panel is on political participation in rural California, and we're going to start off with a presentation by Paula Cruz Takash, who is a doctoral candidate at UC Berkeley and is working on her dissertation on the Watsonville community. And Joaquin Avila, who is the past general counsel for MALDEF, and of course has done a great deal of litigation suits here in California regarding barriers to political participation. And I know both of them very well and had the opportunity to work with them in different capacities. We'll also have Juan Arambula, who's on the Fresno School Board, Victor Lopez, the mayor of Orange Cove, and Roy Rodriguez, who's a city council member from the city of Orange Cove as well. So with that, I will start, just pass it right over to Paula, who will have, since we are on I think everyone is pretty burned out. We're going to try and move and cut these down rather than 20-minute presentations, make them like 12-minute presentations. And we'll see, it'll probably stretch into 20 anyway.
Thank you very much, Bill, and I'm really pleased to be here and to see that members of the Orange Cove community and from Fresno, metropolitan Fresno, are able to be here with us and share their points of view about political participation. Basically, we were asked we approached the task of reviewing the literature and ongoing research on Chicano-Mexicano political participation in rural California, with the sense that our search was not going to result in an extensive list of published materials or research in progress. Our assumption was not unfounded. While there is a large literature regarding Chicano politics, much of it has been produced by Chicano scholars. The vast majority of the studies addressed urban-based political efforts on the parts of Chicanos, Mexicanos, and their supporters. Another portion of the literature is theoretical work utilizing Marxist or historical structural analysis to explain the subordinate social, political, and economic position of Chicanos and Mexicanos in the United States. And lately, what we're seeing are articles and books addressing the potential political and social effects of the rapid growth of the Latino population in the United States at the national or state level. The published work that focuses on Mexicano and Chicano politics in rural California has been devoted almost exclusively to historical studies documenting farm worker protests and strikes in the early half of this century, or studies about the life and political struggles of Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers Union. As a result, by the early 1970s, emerging Chicano political scientists called for a redirection of scholarly attention away from Chicano-Mexicano political activity in the rural areas to a new focus on this ethnic group's political activities in urban centers. This redirection was expressed in a 1973 dissertation by Carlos Munoz Jr., who's a professor of political science in the Chicano Studies Department at UC Berkeley. He says, during the 60s and 70s, various dramatic demonstrations of protest on the part of the nation's second largest oppressed minority have taken place throughout the urban centers of the southwestern United States. For the most part, however, the politics of Chicano urban protest remains little understood by both non-Chicanos and Chicanos themselves. The fact that the national predominance of Cesar Chavez and the farm workers' struggle have captured the imagination of the mass media, politicians, and social scientists explains in part the perpetuation the perpetuation of the popular stereotype of the Chicanos as an ethnic minority group that remains confined to the rural sector of American society. There is a paucity of scholarly literature on Chicano politics, and a serious and systematic study of Chicano urban protest is yet to emerge. The subsequent analysis of Chicano-Mexicano oppression based on the structure of political and economic oppression represents a significant advance in our knowledge of Chicano-Mexicano politics and ethnic politics in general. Unfortunately, the development of this approach based on Latino urban protest has been constructed at the expense of analyses of Chicano and Mexicano political participation in the political economy of rural places. Scholarship about Chicano and Mexicano political participation will not be best served by calling for another reorientation away from urban locales and back to the rural areas. Yet our knowledge remains incomplete if we continue to focus exclusively on the former. Several features of Chicano-Mexicano political participation in rural California beg scholarly attention, and may also enhance our knowledge of Chicano-Mexicano urban politics. For example, our research indicates that in 1987, the majority of the California Hispanic elected officials at the municipal level have been elected in rural places. These preliminary findings suggest real changes in the past decade and a half in non-urban and small-town political economies. And frankly, we don't know what it means. That research yet has to be done. A Civil Rights Commission staff study conducted in 1971 concluded that Latino representation in municipal government in small towns and rural places was very low when compared to their statewide population. Rural counties generally appear to offer inadequate opportunities for Mexican Americans to participate in governmental functions. Persons from several rural towns appeared before the Civil Rights Commission to testify about the difficulties Latinos encountered when they sought to become political participants, and argued that, quote, pressures facing rural Mexican Americans who attempt to become politically active are quite different from those confronting urban Mexican Americans. Now, given these preliminary findings that we've come up with, that in fact the majority of our elected officials in California are in the rural areas, we have to question the finding of the earlier Civil Rights Commission study. It could have been true at the time, and we might be looking at that there are changes in these communities that might explain why we have more elected officials in the rural areas. Now, we don't know. The research has not been done. The overwhelming majority of Latino elected officials in California are at the municipal level. This is also true of Latino elected officials in other states. In a hand count of all Latino mayors and city council members in California, we discovered that out of a total of 142 Latino municipal representatives, 88, or 63.3, serve in rural communities. What we were using for our sample are just mayors and council persons. 17 cities have 3 or more Latino representatives, and of these, 11 are rural communities. 6 are cities within 1 urban designated county. Of the 11 rural counties, 10 have Latino mayors. 4 of the 6 urban cities have Latino mayors. I just want to show you a map that I made up which depicts this, I think more graphically, if I can work this. Doesn't seem to all fit on here, but of import, I think, is that these are California cities with 3 or more Chicano council representatives, so mayors and city council persons. And you can see that they're concentrated basically in Fresno County, 2 in Monterey County. There are, I believe there are 6 in Los Angeles County, and 2 in the Imperial Valley, 1 in Riverside. Again, of those, the majority, 88 of the 142, of all elected representatives, Hispanic representatives, are in the rural areas. Again, the findings suggest social, political, and economic changes in rural California, as well as in the state during the past decade. They also suggest that Latino representation in California urban cities, where the majority of Chicanos and Mexicanos are concentrated, is even more severely limited than aggregate numbers of elected Latino officials may lead us to believe. Obviously, achieving representation in governmental institutions which make decisions that affect our communities is but one political issue of concern to Chicanos and Mexicanos. And our participation in electoral politics is just one means to achieve this particular end. Juan Ruiz wrote in his introduction to Richard Santillan's book, Chicano Politics, La Raza Unida, politics is not an election time phenomenon. Politics is the everyday world of wealth and poverty and conflict. In the case of the Chicanos, politics is 20% unemployment in Boyle Heights, 40,000 functional illiterates in the Los Angeles Unified School District, police harassment and intimidation, and the highest prison population. Some of today's speakers that we had an opportunity to hear have already raised other issues of concern to Latinos and have addressed how these issues are manifested in rural California: employment, health, housing, and poverty. And we could add on a few more of poverty's stepchildren, that is drug addiction, alcoholism, crime, and family violence. One of the issues that wasn't addressed today, but has often been cited as one of the most critical issues facing our community, is education. The intolerable dropout rate of our high school youth, the lack of retention of Latino youths who are admitted into colleges and universities, and the assaults on bilingual education programs. What all these issues share in common is that every issue has a political side to it. Active attempts to redress these problems eventually result in the advocate group coming up against a governmental body. For example, in order to bring medical services to an underserved population, Chicanos and Mexicanos fought for the creation of migrant farm worker clinics. A moral and health issue would eventually become political as clinic advocates would seek recognition and resources from local, state, and federal governmental agencies. The result of this example of Chicano-Mexicano political participation in the San Joaquin Valley are the founding of the United Health Centers and Sequoia Community Health Foundation Incorporated. Ensuring the existence of these clinics requires a continual political participation of clinic administrators and board members. Daycare services for farm workers' children in a rural San Joaquin community became a political struggle the moment when city officials refused to fund the project, and when their refusal did not make the project's Chicano advocates drop their pursuit. It has been suggested that not only did the Anglo-dominated council's refusal fail to stop the acquisition of a farm workers' daycare center in the community, but also motivated Chicano-Mexicano residents to run for city council and eventually dominate the council. In the agriculturally based community of Watsonville, Santa Cruz County, the mobilization of Latino parents by a naturalized Mexicana around the issue of education in the early 1970s resulted in the Pajaro Valley School District being forced to spend federal funds earmarked for minority students for this purpose rather than on equipment purchases as the district had been. Organizing themselves into a community political action group, the Mexicano and Chicano parents also forced the school board to approve the hiring of bilingual staff and teachers, and to institute the district's first bilingual education programs. In 1987, new coalitions of Latino teachers, administrators, and parents and their non-Latino supporters are embroiled in a political struggle to ensure the continuation of programs that meet the needs of Chicano and Mexicano children. In the mid-1970s, protests by Chicano and Mexicano residents about the lack of affordable housing in Watsonville pitted them against city council and county elected officials, but resulted in the construction of a state-run migrant labor camp and some low-income housing. A fledgling housing task force created by members of the local LULAC chapter last year has evolved into a body of Latino grassroots leaders sophisticated in housing issues and of local, county, and regional housing experts who have volunteered their expertise and time to address the dire need for housing. The LULAC Housing Task Force has successfully championed their cause before the County Board of Supervisors, but has met resistance every step of the way from the Watsonville City Council. This political battle, like most, spills out of the city chambers into the larger public arena of the community via the media. Labor struggles, obviously, are not self-contained within the industries which employ the workers. The 18-month-long strike against a major frozen food plant in Watsonville resulted in the politicalization of Chicana and Mexicana workers who had never before been involved in politics. The frozen food workers soon discovered that they would not only have to master the politics of their own union, as it was unresponsive to their needs, but that they would also have to defend themselves politically before a lame duck city council and sympathetic, and sympathetic county board of supervisors. Before the county at large, which tried to ease its conscience in the beginning by making donations through their own churches, but which increasingly came to view the strikers as the aggressors due to their unnecessary violent actions. They also had to defend themselves before their church officials who would attempt to prevent the strikers from mixing politics, their need for a livable wage in order to house, feed, educate, and ensure the health of their families, from mixing politics with religion. The Watsonville Cannery Strike, as it is popularly referred to, began in September of 1985 and was settled in February of 1987. Many of the former strikers continue to be politically active and have carried their political expertise that they learned on the job of striking to other canneries whose workers are out on strike. We anticipate that come November, some of the former strikers will make a bid for elected positions within the Teamsters Union Local 912, and to ensure a union that is more responsive to workers' needs. We also anticipate that former strikers will not limit their political participation to union politics in the future. Frozen food workers have eloquently expressed how their own struggle was fettered by other political institutions which lack Latino representation. A year after the cannery strike was in progress, strikers were asked in a roundtable discussion if they thought the political climate in the city had changed. The 5 participants answered in the affirmative. One Mexicana stated, "I think that it has. I think the city council has been very much against the strikers since we went out. People like Consul, the owner of Watsonville Canyon at the time, and others, when they go to the city council, right away they get help. But when the strikers go for help, they never give it to us. They always find us guilty. They find the police, they send the police on us, and they blame the strikers even if it's not true. Before we had more faith in them. It's all been lost because of what happened with the strike." A Mexicano striker concurred that the police and city council are on the side of the boss and against workers. However, he maintained that these institutions have had to make some concessions to the strikers because of the effectiveness of the workers' political pressures. More recently, he said, after almost a year on strike, they have taken the side of the workers, even if it has only been verbally. They say that they want to help us, but that's because we've pressured them. We have been there constantly and pressured them to do something, but of their own free will, they never did that before. What they are doing now, they are looking at the elections that are coming up. They know that they depend on us as to whether they will return to power. But something else we have learned is that we have the right to vote, and not only ourselves, but our families. Our children and our friends should register to vote, and we have to look at who we are voting for, which people will represent us. One last quote. A Chicana striker leader added, "In the upcoming elections, we have to unite and vote to give Latinos more representation because all the people are white, the city council members. The times we have gone there, it's been very noticeable that they see us with great indifference. They don't care about raza workers. That is why we want to unite to get more representation and more Latino representation." I was told today at this conference earlier that last Sunday, this Chicana strike leader, Gloria Betancourt, was just elected as a Jesse Jackson delegate to the 16th Congressional District. She received the highest number of votes of all those that were elected, which ensures that she will go. And I think this is a very good indicator of what we're talking about, political empowerment, an indicator of the razas, political involvement, and the possibility of political empowerment. Thank you.
It's interesting that the next speaker is also deals with Watsonville, although he's not going to talk about Watsonville, I don't think. He's going to talk more in general terms. But I also am doing some studies on Watsonville. In fact, there's other people in this room that are too, and so there's a lot of us who have a common experience. And I think that while Watsonville is only one of many cities in the state that are going through its own effort for political empowerment, some of the lessons from these small towns are very, very rich, and in fact give us a lot of insight into not only the barriers of political empowerment, but how they can be overcome. And now Joaquin will talk about some of those barriers and his recommendations around that.
I think it's very useful to reiterate some of the points that Paula has made with respect to political participation and the importance of the political process to some of the things that we've been talking about. We have heard presentations today concerning housing, concerning health, concerning educational issues, and as well as things such as farm labor standards. All of these issues relate to governmental entities. And yet, we have heard very little discussion whatsoever on the political process and how it relates to these governmental entities. More specifically, how it is that these issues can be addressed through the electoral process by increasing electoral participation. Electoral participation, in my opinion, should focus on assessing a particular type of election system and whether it is more conducive toward increasing voter participation. And we're not just talking about just a minority issue, we're basically talking about how we can improve the responsiveness of the governmental entity toward a given community. Now, many of you might think that how is it that an election on a school board or a city council can have a direct impact on those persons, those farm workers who are working in rural communities that are often located outside of the boundaries of these political entities? Well, it has very direct application because these communities do not operate in isolation. Elections to the city councils, elections to local school boards result in political impact. Political impact on county board of supervisorial elections, political impact on state legislative elections, political impact on congressional elections. Elected officials, when the appropriate pressure is applied, can then set standards, can then set particular regulations, can then provide funds to particular agencies to monitor the implementation of those regulations. So we are talking about how is it that we can construct a system of election which will provide the greatest amount of responsiveness. The only way we can do that is by making these elected officials more accountable. So what kind of a system, election system, makes these elected officials more accountable? In my opinion, the biggest obstacle toward increased voter participation in California is the at-large election system. Now, the at-large election system is utilized by 90% of all the cities in California, well over 90% of all the school boards in California. Now, why is an at-large election system bad? An at-large election system has very negative impact on minority voter participation in this manner. Let's assume we have a city or a school board that consists of 30 to 40% Spanish origin population. And let's assume that the Hispanic population, the Latino population, has fielded candidates to run for office. In an at-large election system, where you don't have any districts, and you have racially polarized voting, the Latino community is going to consistently lose. And that has been demonstrated across California and in many of the cases that I've been involved in. Now, for those of you who don't understand the concept of at-large elections, it's as if all of the congresspersons in California didn't have districts, and they could come from any part of the state. If we didn't have congressional districts, probably most of your congressional representatives would come from the Los Angeles, San Diego, Orange County, etc. area. In order to avoid that kind of thing, you have congressional districts. And what we are trying to do is apply that same concept to local elections. Now, with respect to Hispanic and Black communities, and Asian communities to a certain extent, we are assuming that there is racially polarized voting. That is to say that the Anglo community does not support candidates favored or preferred by the minority community. Statistically, that has been demonstrated time and time again. California is no different from other states or other parts of the Southwest. We have found very strong patterns of racially polarized voting in places like Watsonville, in places like Stockton, in places like Los Angeles. Racially polarized voting is an unfortunate fact of our political experience in this country. Courts have said when you have racially polarized voting, the election system should not permit such a phenomenon to be used as an advantage. And that's why, in many instances, courts have struck down at-large election systems. Now, at-large election systems also have a negative impact on local issues, local neighborhoods, local communities. So the negative impact of at-large elections isn't just limited to persons of color. Where you have an at-large election system, it's very difficult, if not impossible in many situations, for local communities to take their grievances to their elected officials and to secure a redress of those grievances. Why? Because the at-large elected officials can ignore, if they want to, can ignore those particular communities. So at-large elections doesn't necessarily just mean that it's going to have a discriminatory impact, the potential for discriminatory impact on minority communities. It also does not provide representation from local communities. And that is true whether the city is 100% Hispanic or 100% black. Irrespective of the race or the color, the political process, as a result of participating in the political process, you have incumbencies, you have political dynasties that establish, and an at-large election system may not in fact permit the development of local representation. And that's why it's so important for us to identify the at-large election system as the most serious obstacle that we as Hispanics are facing with respect to our attempts to politically integrate ourselves in the society at large. And I believe that we have a very limited timetable to accomplish all of this. And that is because the percentage of minorities in California is increasing dramatically. It is anticipated that by the year 2000, California will become a minority state. If we don't have such a large growing community, politically, educationally, and economically integrated in this society, we're going to be facing some very severe problems. Where are the people who are dropping out from school now? Where are they going to be 10 or 15 years from now? Are they going to be part of the body politic? So we must take steps now to increase that voter participation so that we can make these governmental entities more responsive to everyone. Now, the issue, I think, before this conference is one of recognizing that many of the topics that you have been discussing today ultimately relate to the political process. And it is important for us to recognize that there are election mechanisms which favor increased voter participation, which can then make these election officials more accountable. Now, this effort to create districts and eliminate at-large elections is not something that just started just within the past couple of years. It is interesting that there were district elections toward the turn of the century, and it was only with the so-called reforms in the early 1900s that at-large elections were instituted. And when one investigates those reforms, one finds that there was a racial basis for having at-large elections. And that racial basis was to exclude blacks from the political process, to exclude other minorities, not necessarily just Latinos, other minorities in given communities. One investigation that I did in a Texas city, we find that from the early 1800s, 1850s or so, up until 1900, there were a lot of German sounding or German surnames. After they had district elections, they decided that after they had these persons were elected as a result of district elections. When they had converted to at-large elections, all those names disappeared. You had nice-sounding Anglo-Saxon names. So you have to view this in the historical context. The at-large election systems has been used since the turn of the century to the present in many states in the Southwest. And we, as a result of the Voting Rights Act, are now working affirmatively and aggressively to try to eliminate these at-large election systems. Now, the track record of converting from districts to, converting from at-large to districts for electing Hispanic officials has been substantial. When you look at what's happened in Texas, when you look at those political subdivisions which have converted from at-large to districts, we find that there's a significant increase in Hispanic representation. So that is the primary message I want to leave with you. However, there are very specific things, very specific recommendations, specific research issues which you must at least start to think about. Those relate to increasing the citizenship base in the Latino community. It is my understanding that in some parts of this country, you don't have to be a citizen to vote. To vote in, for example, school board elections in some part of this country. We need to have research as to whether the new Immigration Reform and Control Act will have an impact in increasing this pool of potential eligible voters. We need to also have research into voting patterns in local communities. We also need research into the political histories of local communities, because it is that kind of research that will have very direct application, not only to litigation efforts, but to legislative efforts, to correct the problem. As Jim Lorenz says, let's find what is the solution. Let's discuss those solutions. The solution is to eliminate those discriminatory election devices. One way that we have to do that is by doing research. And that research will be very critical in forming the foundation for our litigation and possible legislative efforts. Thank you.
We'll have questions afterwards. What we are going to do now, actually, we have the fortune of having 3 of the elected officials from Valley Communities right here, and they're going to comment on what we just heard from Paula and from Joaquin. One of the things, I had a chance yesterday before, over a bar situation, to hear their presentation much more thoroughly. And we were talking about the fact that it's not so much simply getting more people elected, although that's an aspect of power. A lot of times what happens is we get them elected and find out that the power relations remain the same, because the seat of power is not simply through the electoral process, but has to do more with who holds class power, who holds property, who holds corporate rule, who has banking interest, developer interest, and in fact can move those interests or dictate those interests, oftentimes to the disadvantage of the city council or mayor. And I hope that perhaps our next speakers can talk not only about their reaction to the recommendations and make some comments, but also talk about some of their own difficulty in being school board members, mayor, and city council members in conditions that perhaps they don't have the total power of the city. And I would like to first start off with Victor Lopez, who is the mayor of Orange Cove. And then he'll be followed by Roy Rodriguez, who's a councilman from Orange Cove, and Juan Arambulo, Fresno board of school board. Victor?
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here today, this afternoon with you. Okay, I will start off by giving you a brief history of myself. I come from a poor farm-working family of 12 agricultural workers. We moved to Los Angeles when I was 5 years old, and I was the individual that went before the city council wanting them to establish a daycare center for farm workers, and they stated that it was not necessary in the community, and if you didn't like it, do something about it. So I did. In 1974, I was the first Hispanic elected official in the history of that city. Okay, can you hear me there? Okay, after I finished my term as an elected official, of course, I was the only Hispanic on the city council, and basically I try to utilize that experience there, reading up on the material and looking at the system, how it operates. But I communicated well with the community so that the community would know where I was coming from. And part of the study is it indicated how much power you have. Sometimes you find out that you really don't have any power unless you can manipulate the system and study the system and utilize your colleagues to convince them to go along with your projects. So my first 4 years as a councilman in the community was basically a learning experience for me and exposing the city council that they were not fairly representing their community. And in 1978, I decided to run for mayor of the city of Orange Cove, and I was the first Hispanic elected mayor in the history of that city. And along with myself, I needed 2 other individuals, and I got Mr. Rodriguez and Mr. Villarreal to join me, and we ran on a slate and we got elected. Then we started the agenda of the community, defining the problems, trying to solve the problems, and it's been quite an experience. And I'm happy now to say that in our community, we made several changes. Definitely there is changes going to be made. If your heart is in the right place, and you do as you said you were going to do, you're out there in the forefront, and people are going to judge you. People ain't naive to see what you're there for. People are very smart. The Hispanic community is very conservative, and they expect you to take care of business. They hold you accountable. It is very important to hold elected officials accountable. You cannot then let them slide. You can't. If they're there to represent you, they must do the job. They ran on a certain platform, make them stick to their platform. Make them deliver. And if they don't, remove them. I am an individual that will state that it's not color. I support Caucasians or whites or whatever you want to call them. You know, they label us. I'm Hispanic, a Chicano, and you name it. But I'm still a human being. But I believe that that individual that is up there and elected by the community ought to be held accountable and ought to take care of business. For example, I think that we are the only city, probably in California, that has a Chicano city administrator. Of course, we're shooting to the stars. We probably have the only chief of police Hispanic. We have a finance director that's a Hispanic. Okay? I believe that we must give our people an opportunity if they qualify. And they are qualified individuals. They have the credentials. They have the experience. And I believe we ought to give them an opportunity. I don't believe that we have to discriminate against our own. I think we have to set the example and have role models in the communities, in our communities that are Hispanics, that are able to do a good job and a decent job, and that we can all be proud of. We in turn look at the situation. For example, I think we're failing in letting our communities know why do we run for office? What is there if we elect Hispanics in office? You know, is it viable? Do we benefit from it? A good example, we contract millions of dollars out. Do they go to minority contractors? I believe we must assure that a portion of the pie goes to the Hispanic community. I think an economics base is needed in the community to address the issues of economic justice, the issue of discrimination. I think that we have needed an economic base. And with an economic base, I believe that we can let our community know, inform our community better. I am proud to say that I voted in favor of contracts to minorities in our community. We are working in multi-million-dollar developments in our community, and I believe that the Hispanics ought to be part of that. And I think that we ought to be proud of and not to be ashamed. But we have to make sure that those individuals deliver the product that is a good product, and that they are doing a good job so that we can all stand there and say, you did right. And I'm proud of the mayor that I've been able to vote on those issues. and able to stand on my record and say, we must be part of the political system. You see the barrios, no curb and gutter, no streets, no nothing. Why? Because nobody has cared. Some people might believe that's a minute, but it's not when you're flooding the homes of the low income. Because of lack of drainage, lack of infrastructure. I think we got to address the barrios and make them beautiful places and decent places to live in. It's the tax dollar that belongs to every individual. And when the elected officials cut the pie, I believe they ought to cut it equally around and reflected the community, the total community. If we don't, we're doing an injustice. So, I'm hoping that we don't elect elected officials just because of the color of their skin. But I believe we ought to elect individuals that care, that are caring, and they're going to stand there and be proud and do as they say, so that we can all be proud to be Americans. The system is the best, is the democratic system, and I don't believe there's a country that has a system like ours, where you, the people, decide. Thank you very much.
Next, Roy Rodriguez, who's on the city council from Orange Cove, is going to also comment on what impact having had 2 members of the city council and a mayor have meant for Orange Cove.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. As the mayor stated, we did come in into the city council in 1978. As a result, not because we wanted to be city councilmen, because we like power, but because there were needs. Needs that people apparently had gone before the previous council and asked, even to the point of demanding, such as a restroom in a public park, low-income housing, you know, and so shall we say, at the time, the system would say, well, you know, we need to study, we need to table. It will be addressed at a different time, you know, and time again, you know, we found that this was the end result of us going before the council that was in power. And it was a council of individuals that had been there for 15 to 20 years, that were winning elections by 50 votes. Because realistically, the people were not politically aware. They thought, well, this is the way it's supposed to be. And we said, oh, wait a minute, you know, it's not the way it's supposed to be. So then we went into the communities, house to house, talking to our neighbors and saying, look, we can do something about your needs and your wants, and we are willing to put ourselves in that position, you know, of asking for your vote in order to take care of these needs. Orange Cove is a small community. It's composed of about 6,000 people. But to us, it's home. To us, it's like Fresno City. Because we live there. And the comparison, as I'm saying, what was it like when the system or the old council was there, like we say, the people that had served since the city was incorporated? What was it like, and what is it now like? Okay, what is it now like? Is it that we are addressing the needs of the people that are not the well-to-do, that are not shall we say, even the farmers, because, you know, as you know, in those areas, who calls the shots? You know, it's realistically, you know, it's the farmers, you know, and even though they are employers, they were not interested in meeting the immediate needs of our people. Our people being the people from the city of Orange Cove. Not Hispanics, but all the people of Orange Cove. Filipinos, whites, Hispanics, Indians, which is what we have in Orange Cove. And that is why, you know, I'm saying to you that we came into this position that we're in, not because we said we want power, we like power, and we also said we would like to have the people that are providing the services in the city hall, at Public Works, represent the people that live in the city. Even speak the language if necessary, because it was a time where you couldn't even find one individual that you could go to say, I need help in their native language, you know. And we said to ourselves, look, you know, we need to address these needs, you know, and we're not talking about discrimination against anybody. We're just saying we want to address the needs. And basically, that is why the mayor and myself are in this position at this time. Thank you very much.
I want to thank both Victor and Roy. And now the next speaker is Juan Arambula, who is from the Fresno School Board. And we're going to take a shift from the city politics to education politics. And I just might say that as a political scientist, one of the things that has been shown is that oftentimes for minorities, and particularly for Raza, that the entry point into politics is actually twofold, usually through union efforts and also through education. And so the entry of Chicanos into the school boards is often a launching pad for later on running for higher political office. Juan, you want to talk about that and maybe your prospects for the next few years?
When I was asked to make a couple of comments here today, I was reminded of what Mark Twain said many years ago. He was asked to make a presentation, and he asked how long he would be expected to speak. He said, if you want me to speak for an hour, I'm ready right now. If you want me to speak for 10 minutes, you better give me 6 months to prepare. Well, I haven't had 6 months, so I hope you'll bear with me. But I'm somewhat the oddball in this group. I am someone who ran in an at-large election and won. And let me give you a little bit of background as to why I ran and what the situation was as I was trying to decide whether to run or not. First of all, I think I've been preparing for this for all my life. My parents were farm workers. We traveled up and down the valley here in the San Joaquin Valley to Hollister, to Yuba City and whatnot. And as you traveled, you saw a lot of injustices. And at some point, I determined that if I ever had an opportunity, I would try to redress some of these injustices. Particularly last year, I was a member of a committee dealing with dropouts, and I began to see the magnitude of the problem, and I felt that the school district was not taking the correct approach to resolving the problems, and I began to consider that possibility of running for the school board. Now, what really tipped me over the edge, or perhaps what drove me off the cliff more accurately, is that there was a school member, and I say there was, who said last year that he was not particularly concerned about the fact that certain areas of town were not receiving their equal share of resources. He basically said something to the effect that if these children are not doing well, then perhaps we're better off taking resources away from those children and putting them to the north side of town where children are learning, where they are doing better. Now that really ticked me off because some years ago, I'm sure I would have been smack dab in the middle of that group that he was so cavalierly dismissing. My parents spoke no English. My father and my mother had no formal education, not even one day of school. I spoke Spanish when I started elementary school. We were migrants, we were obviously low income, and I would have been the person or in the group of persons that this individual, this ex-board member, would have so easily dismissed. And I said, that's just not right. Now, when I started to seriously consider this possibility, I had to assess this situation. First of all, no Chicano had won in any type of position within the city of Fresno for a number of years. We had lost a succession of elections for city council persons, for supervisors, there had not been a Chicano. I think there's been one other than myself, and that was back in the mid-70s, pardon me. Short of that, there had not been any successful election by a Hispanic candidate in a number of years. People were very disappointed. There was a thirst for a successful election. At the same time, nobody wanted to run. And in part because nobody had won in a long time, in large part because it wasn't that large election, which required the candidate to run in all of Fresno. And let me give you some idea of what we're talking about. The city of Fresno has and this is Fresno Unified, so it covers all of the city and parts of the county. We're talking roughly about 300,000 people, in excess of 160,000 registered voters. And it seemed impossible for a Hispanic candidate to win, particularly since the two incumbents, there were two positions open. Both incumbents had been there for a number of years. One individual for 8 years and the other individual for 16 years. I was basically told, and I was told by the other Hispanic board member who had been on back in the 70s, that I should run, but with the expectation that I would lose and that I should try again at the next election. Well, I said, forget it, I'm not going to go through this twice. And I determined that I was going to win this particular election, or I was going to do everything humanly possible to win it. Now, I figured since we didn't have the votes in terms of our own people, that we had to be a little more sophisticated about how we ran our campaign. Throughout the campaign, we used the analogy of a duck. On the surface, we didn't appear to be doing much of anything. Underneath the surface, we were paddling furiously, doing any number of things, trying to get the election going. We did not want to tip our hand. We did not want to tip our strength to the incumbents. We didn't want them to get too anxious and then be able to mount a counterattack. We wanted essentially to lull them into a sense of security. And then when it was too late, goodbye. That in fact is what happened. The election was won it was the first time in the history of Fresno Unified that any incumbent had been beaten. And I beat both incumbents, and I beat them by a large margin. And this was something that has had a very dramatic effect on other people. Now other people are getting very animated about running. It's had a tremendous effect on the psychology or the political situation here in Fresno. Now, one of the ways that we did it is that we ran what's called a diminished universe. In other words, we said, we know we can't win just with our votes. Where are the votes? And once we knew where the votes were, we targeted those votes. For example, I learned that most of the votes, not surprisingly, were in North Fresno. So that's where I walked. I walked and I walked and I walked, and I would talk to people, and we carried practically every single precinct in the city of Fresno. We knew that we'd have a tremendous amount of support from the Chicano community, from the southeast, and we had many friends in the black community, and we knew that the balance of power lay on the north side of Fresno. And as it turned out, we carried practically every precinct. We were either number 1 or number 2 in all of the precincts, and we won by a very healthy margin. You should have seen the pandemonium the night of the election, because when the absentee ballots came in, we were slightly behind. Each time the results came out, we'd be closer and closer. Finally, we tied for second place, and the next results that came out, we were ahead in first place by a healthy margin, and we never looked back. Now, there's been a number of benefits that I think people like myself can bring to a job like this. First of all, it does affect the way that we are treated or considered by other folks. For example, having put together somewhat of a machine, now people court us. Will you please endorse us for city council, for supervisor, for county board of education? We wield a great deal of power collectively. Also, I think that I have a lot of human skills that I bring to the job. It's not just having my master's in school administration or my law degree from Berkeley and having done undergraduate work at Harvard. I mean, all the Anglos would say, gee, that's one smart Mexican. Maybe we ought to consider voting for him. But there's also a lot of human skills. In other words, in my family, one of the things I learned is how to get along with people. I came from a large family. I think I have a lot of people skills, and these skills are serving me very well on the board in terms of being able to put together coalitions with the other 4 board, at least on most issues, with the other 4 board members. I think that people like ourselves, once we do get into positions of authority, have a great deal to offer. We are able to see what we have in common. We are able to humanize this electoral process. And it's just a matter of trying to get over the hump, trying to get elected. Now, when I ran, I decided I wasn't going to run just to raise issues. There had been a number of candidates before me who ran because they wanted to raise the dropout issue. They wanted to raise a particular issue that was near and dear to their heart. I figured I can do that once I'm elected. I'm not going to go through all this sacrifice. I'm not going to put my family through this ordeal just to raise some issues, as important as they may be. I can get to those once I'm in office. And in fact, that's what we are doing. We have followed through on a number of commitments that I made during the election. We have pared down the administration. We have put teachers back in the classroom. We are holding folks accountable from the top on down. We are making progress in a number of areas. We have a long ways to go, but the fact is, as was said before, you really have to judge people according to what they deliver. Are they serious? Do they have the ability to follow through and promise with what they delivered? Now, when I did run, I tried to stress values that we all have in common. I think many times other parties, other people have tried to steal our issues. For example, why should the Republicans be the only ones who care about family, who care about hard work, who care about values, who care about discipline? Our people care about these things, and there's no sense shying away from them. And in fact, I was very surprised to find that practically everybody in the city was agreeing with the issues I was raising. In fact, even being of Mexican descent helped in many ways, because I found many of the people here in Fresno are immigrants. And what I would say is, born of immigrant parents, and people like that. They like those types of approaches. They like the fact that I was stressing what we had in common. And I didn't run against any of the other candidates. I ran on the qualifications and on the issues. I didn't team up. We didn't do any slates. But the fact is that, at least in this particular case, the people of Fresno were willing to give me a chance. And since then, I've been very well received, and I hope during the next 4 years to have an excellent track record of having accomplished a great deal. We have a number of problems, dropouts, and so on, and we are making some inroads in that area, in all of those areas. And I guess as a final point, I never would have run had I been one single candidate. Now, we didn't have a slate, there weren't other Chicanos running, but what made it practical for me to even consider it is that there were at least 2 other board members who were not up for re-election that I felt I could work with very closely, and we would be able to teach the administration of this school district one simple thing: how to count to 3. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juan. Now, doesn't that sound like a candidate for higher office? Actually, since politics has to do with controversy and debate, one of the things we're going to do right now, before we open up to questions, is add a little controversy. The recommendation that Joaquin had made has to do with the question of at-large elections. And of course, people know that, or maybe you don't know, that before the state legislature right now is a bill, the Chacon bill, AB 2191, which, if passed, would require that cities that have school boards with ADA of more than 1,000 average daily attendance of more than 1,000, would require that they have district elections. And that would have a profound effect on school board elections throughout the state of California. Now, there was a similar bill, 2090, which has been basically tabled, which would have required single-member districts for cities and for towns. And I think that the threshold in that case was 10,000. That has been tabled. The recommendation that Joaquin has put forward is that instead of having at-large elections, that we have single-member districts. Now, there is some dissent here, and I think it would be good to have a little reaction. Victor Lopez, who is mayor of Orange Cove, if you can take 2 minutes and give some of your comments, because I know that in the case of Orange Cove, that is a city that has at-large elections, and also Fresno has at-large elections. Also, Joaquin and I are working together on a political empowerment task force in Santa Clara County, and one of the cities that has 3 representatives of the city council is Gilroy, and they are opposed to changing the at-large elections. So maybe we can have some discussion on that, Victor. And then I'll let Joaquin respond, and then we'll open up the questions.
Thank you very much. I personally would be in favor of district elections, even though that I am elected at large in my community. I think that we're the only community, with the exception of Fresno, that elects its mayor directly. The mayors are usually in Fresno County are appointed by their colleagues on the city council. I am elected at large by the citizens of my community, but I believe that the council seats ought to go by district and give better representation and fair representation. I noticed the League of California Cities last month when the issue came up. You couldn't believe it. They swore them up there and they said, no way, shape, or form. Something's wrong.
Well, so much for controversy. Joaquin can add his voice anyway to open it for questions.
All right, I'll open up for questions. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I just wanted to hear Joaquin's response to the fact that both of you, Mr. Arambula and you have been elected through, district-wide elections. This would seem to counter the theory that Maydrop's votes representation is at large districts.
Well, I think it does. In my community, for example, you look at Orange Cove, it's got about 67% Hispanic, but the fact is that about 50% of those cannot vote. They're not American citizens. Okay? But the fact is that we're voting 100% in my community. We go door to door, and I'm probably the only mayor that won 30 days before the election, because I knew how many votes I had in the bank. I did the absentee.
So who put you in power? Was it the whites or the Filipinos or the Chicanos there?
Well, I think that looking at Orange Cove, I think that small rural communities, are not that bad if you go at large. I am more concerned about the larger communities that have no representation at all. I would look at for example, communities maybe of 10,000 that they have to go by district. And I think that the smaller communities, since they're closer to their community, closer to the people, I think the people have close communications. You can understand who can fairly represent it better. I would be looking at bigger populated cities. And like I say, in our community, basically voting 100%, and this is why we have representation in my community. Yes, sir.
My question is directed.
Wait, before you do, I think Joaquin should have a chance to respond to that other question first. And then we'll go to the other questions.
Yes, I would just like to add that the AB 2191 provides that school districts that have a 1,000 student average daily attendance over that 1,000, that they would have a special election to determine whether they would continue to have at-large elections. And at that special election, the electorate, at least as the bill is now before the Senate Reapportionment Committee, would have to vote in favor of maintaining at-large elections by a 2/3 vote. If it did not meet that 2/3 vote, then single-member districts would be implemented after the 1990 census. Now, with respect to the utilization of at-large elections or single-member districts, at what threshold level would one create a division? federal courts have not made any such distinction. They have applied them, single-member districts have been applied to cities as low as 1,000 and less than 1,000. And the reasoning behind it is that even though you may have instances where in some places in the South minorities have been elected, the fact that in many other elections there had been instances of racially polarized voting which prevented the minorities from getting elected, it doesn't matter that the city may be 500 or 1,500 or 10,000. The fact is that if you have racially polarized voting, you have that tendency that at-large elections may operate to submerge minority voting strength. And in places, I mean, even, let's say, for example, here in California, there's no guarantee that any particular city will retain its similar demographic profile because given in many cities, some places in Northern California, the percentage of minorities and Hispanics has actually decreased because of the urban-suburban distinctions where people are working in places like Stockton, traveling to San Francisco, people working in places like Milpitas, working in San Jose, etc. So just because the city right now is 70 or 80%, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to retain that demographic structure.
There was a question in the back there. I think you've tried twice, so finally you have a chance to make your question.
This is directed to Mr. Avila. I don't know if Mr. Avila is still with MALDEF or not. You gave, I applaud your recommendations about the increase citizen base, to do research on the Immigration Act, to look at voting patterns, and to look at the political history of a community. I would like to know, Mr. Avila, while you were at MALDEF, or perhaps you know the history of MALDEF better than I do, maybe you could inform me, us, how has MALDEF helped in terms of implementing this concept of elections at large? I know that some of us in Fresno over the years have sought help. I believe that, and this, I'm not talking about the last 2 or 3 years, I could give evidence of it. If you could cite examples where you have, or MALDEF has helped, because to do the kind of research requires some funds, and when some of us, and I refer specifically to El Concilio de Fresno, have sought funds from foundations, they look at us, without getting into a lot of history, as quote-unquote being political, even though we have a 501c3 status, or because 51% of the board members are not Anglos. That's a reality. It has come back to us through the National Concilio of America. So the Southwest Voter Registration Project has, of course, its relationship with certain organizations in town. And we find it difficult, then, some of us, I refer specifically to El Concilio, how has MALDEF then, how can it help? Because it becomes a Medusa's head, you know, you cut off one serpent, but then you have another problem. But how has MALDEF helped bring about this concept of elections at large? And by the way, I personally support it because I believe that if you have one man, one vote at the federal and at the state level, then we should have it also locally in whatever election.
Well, not only, maybe Joaquin can respond not only to that, but also, even without MALDEF, what measures can be taken in order to fight at-large elections?
Okay, first, I'm no longer with MALDEF. I was with MALDEF for 11 years, from 1974 to 85. I'm now in private practice since 85, and I've been doing just exclusively voting rights litigation. With respect to why organizations such as MALDEF couldn't come to places like Fresno, it's a question of resources. For example, MALDEF has been very much involved in litigation, or at least when I was there in Texas. It was involved in litigation in many parts of California and Illinois. Unfortunately, although MALDEF may appeared to be a very large organization. It's a group of 20 attorneys back then. And those 20 attorneys were divided up into education areas, employment, and census advocacy, voting rights, etc. So what it translated down to is there were maybe 1 or 2 attorneys in the whole organization that were doing a voting rights litigation agenda. And those 1 or 2 attorneys couldn't cover every jurisdiction as they would like to. They had to divide their time among states like Illinois, Texas, and California. Now here in California, what organizations such as MALDIF has done, they've been involved in litigation with the city of Los Angeles. They are currently supporting litigation against the city of Watsonville. Private attorneys have been involved in the city of Stockton. Organizations like MALDIF and Southwest Voter Registration Project have funded projects, research projects, to try to determine what areas to maybe target for litigation. So although these things aren't very well publicized, these organizations really have been out there at the forefront. And although I personally would like to see them involved in more cities, it's basically a question of resources. Now, what are some of the other things that we can do for trying to at least highlight the problem? I think clearly one would be support of AB 2191. It is before the Senate Reapportionment Committee, and there's 2 senators that are going to kill the bill if they don't receive some support or some indication from the community. And those are, one of them is a very liberal Democrat, Senator Lockyer from Northern California. Another one is not so liberal, Senator Boatwright. But they don't see, they have their reasons as to why they're not supporting such a bill. And if there's one specific thing that could be done, would be to write to them and let them know that you support AB 2191.
Actually, one item, Mula wanted to have a chance to talk about the question of at-large elections as well in terms of application with Fresno.
I was asked during one of the many innumerable candidate nights before the election whether I favored district elections or at-large elections. I, at the time, told people that I would defer a decision until after the election and then let them know afterwards, depending on the results. But I think that I have thought about it a great deal. That there were some folks who were backing me, who were supporting my candidacy, who were very much in support of district elections. And much to their chagrin, I won. And perhaps, and it seems, at least on the surface, that this detracts from their argument in favor of district elections. I don't think it does. First of all, we spent an ungodly amount of money to win. We simply don't have the resources to be putting into races this kind of money. I spent somewhere in the neighborhood of $50,000 to win this campaign. Now, in part, it was because I was taking on entrenched incumbents. I was a relative newcomer, and it took a great deal of visibility in order to win. And now that I am an incumbent, perhaps I ought to be leaning in favor of district elections, because it is very difficult to knock off incumbents precisely for this very reason. It takes a great deal of resources to cover the entire city of Fresno. We have 64,000 students in our district, which is more than many of the towns surrounding Fresno have for inhabitants. Some of the other reasons that would favor district elections are that some of the reasons that I ran, such as the unequal distribution of resources, perhaps could have been dealt with much, much earlier had there been a representative from those areas who was sensitive and who was closer to the population, who was more accountable to that population. It's quite conceivable that some of these difficulties never would have arisen. On the other hand, there are some downsides for district elections, and I speak particularly with regard to some of our city council races here in Fresno. We have a very divided city council. People oftentimes seem more concerned with appeasing their particular constituents than trying to do the best thing for the entire city. I do have the luxury of being an at-large representative, and I can be concerned equally about the problems in North Fresno as I can in South Fresno, the problems with GATE students as in the problems with bilingual students. And this is something that I think speaks well for the at-large system. However, I think in trying to balance the pros and cons, looking at the accountability and the representativeness of district elections, looking at the expense of at-large elections, I think I would be inclined at this point to support district elections simply because it gives us more opportunity. We do need experience, we do need to mature and season ourselves as politicians, as representatives. The only way we're going to do that is by starting to acquire these positions en masse and gain experience thereby. It is going to be messy. There are times that we're going to be at each other's throats. The fact is, when you don't have that experience, you really don't have anything to base your judgments and your decisions on. We do need to go through a maturing process. The only way we're going to do it is by having healthy, respectable numbers of representatives who will acquire that experience over the long run. And that's basically it. I've looked at the pros and cons. I hope seriously that my election is not a deterrent to district, to the effort to establish district elections. I think that in that sense, my election would have been a disservice.
Are there other questions or comments? Yes.
I have a question of Mr. Avila. It's a relationship to voting of Latinos. I've only heard about one study, but there's probably other ones, like South Voter Registration. When they come to the ballot, they've always talking about how there's a poor turnout of Latinos voting. I think it's my personal observation, in local elections, they do vote because those kind of issues impact them and their communication with the candidates. As far as national elections, probably been a lower voter turnout of Latinos. With these coming elections coming, especially national elections, and seeing all the problems that are occurring in the United States, like people are homeless, people are losing their homes, healthcare issues, things like that. You see in this coming national election more Latinos getting involved in the electoral arena, in particular national elections?
Yes, I do, and the reason why, I don't think we can just look at places like California. In Texas, there's been a great deal of litigation, legislative advocacy to eliminate a lot of barriers toward voter participation. And some of that has been at-large elections. Some of it has been gerrymandered districts. For example, in one particular county in Texas, Crockett County, the county supervisorial districts were gerrymandered. I mean, they split the Latino community in half. And as a result of that, although they had one representative on the board, they couldn't get a second one. And what happened after there was a court case and after the lines were drawn, they had an opportunity to select a second person. And as a result of that, voter registration went up to well over 90% within the Latino community. Over 90% of all of the eligible voters in the Latino community registered. Turnout election, it was over 95% of the voters turned out to vote in the Latino community. Whenever our experiences, both the Southwest and other organizations have found, is that when there's a change in the election system, people see that there's an opportunity to have an impact. As a result of that, they have turnout figures have gone up. Now, what that does is that even though these are local school boards and local cities, it has ripple effects on other elections. So when you start developing political organizations at the local level, the persons who are running for statewide office are going to come to those local officials and those local organizations and get them out to vote. And there's where a lot of the political trading goes along. Now, that has been going on in places like Texas. And the reason why is because of all the voting rights litigation activity. And as a result of that, you've had an increased impact in the statewide elections. In Texas, no politician who's running for statewide office can ignore the Hispanic vote. Now, that has not happened here in California for the reason that you have a lot of obstacles at the local level. The philosophy of the Southwest Voter Registration Project is you have to build a base, and that base has to be at the local level. Once you build that base, then when other elections, national and so on, come around, you have an established base from which to pick from. In 1988, in November, we're not going to be in the same stage of development as Texas was in the 70s and 80s. So, but I do see, because of the increased interest within the Latino community to participate in this election, yes, it will be, I think it will be significantly greater than the '84 election. But once we eliminate all these obstacles and get a very strong base, it'll be much higher.
We'll take two last questions or comments. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to go on what you were saying about the '88 elections and direct my question to Paul and ask her essentially what you think the rural vote among Latinos will be this election, both in the primary and in the general.
I think you put me on the spot, and I would also say that you probably would put anybody else on the spot, because I don't know that we know that. Basically, did you want to make? Yeah. Again, I think this is the reason why we all gathered here today, in order to say we need to know information about rural voting patterns in the rural areas. We need to know about the political structures. We need to know whether or not the Chicano-dominated city councils are in fact responsive to their Chicano constituents. There's an awful lot that we don't know. And again, I would hope to see one of the outcomes of a conference like this is to be addressing those issues. And again, not just addressing them in the rural, about rural issues, but to say, what does this also mean for the urban areas? Would anybody else like to?
I think that one answer to your question would be, for example, in the rural areas, if you have an elected official, Chicanos, running for their positions, okay, they'll be able to carry the candidate of their choice. Example is my community, we carry Jesse Jackson, probably the only city in the United States. We carry Jesse Jackson all the way.
In a lot of cities where Latinos are heads of the city, they're not making any commitments. A lot of Latino officials aren't making commitments.
Well, I think that they need to search their conscience and get off the fence and make up their mind where they stand. We know where we stand.
Just one further comment on that. Again, getting back to Watsonville, the example was given earlier that a cannery worker, Gloria Betancourt, one of the leaders of the strike committee during the strike, is now a Jackson delegate. And I think the reason she's a Jackson delegate is because Jackson went there to support her strike. And what it did is, here is a person who never would have considered running as a delegate in her life. In fact, she never would have considered running for union office had it not been for the strike and the whole activity, etc. I think a lot of what we're seeing this time around in 1988 versus 1984 is that there has been, during the last 4 years, a greater conocimiento, a greater understanding in the rural areas as well as the city areas about the issues of Jesse Jackson. And I think what we're seeing, I work with Latinos for Jackson, Northern California co-chair, and I have seen very concretely when we've gone out to different rural communities, a tremendous response that wasn't there 4 years ago. And so it's hard to say whether or not Jackson is going to win in the rural areas, but I certainly think he's activated it. There was another question tonight?
Yes. I wanted to direct it to Joaquin Avila or anybody else, but is there like a coalition as far as statewide of Hispanos that are coming together? I know there's like MAPA, a few others, but I think there's a need to get together as far as consultancy. I think we have a lot of the same needs, a lot of the same issues. I'm from Stockton. We work with Southwest with the registration. But I don't know how effective, and I want to be critical of any one organization, like for example, MAPA, whatever. But you're doing, each one of you is doing some really effective work. Like there's example for a need for Stockton to touch base with like your organization. I'm sure there's a lot of other communities that have that same need. And is there any such coalitions coming together as far as the research, as far as to touch base, as far as consultancy, that type of thing going on in the state?
Okay, this will be the last question. Anybody want to respond to that? Joaquin first?
There are various coalitions that have developed over issues. One such coalition with respect to AB 2191 has been very impressive in the kind of information that has gotten out to our community. Many organizations are participating in those efforts, and I think it's very important to recognize that you may have a coalition for an educational issue which may not have the same participants in the political access arena. And many of these coalitions don't have buildings, don't have an endowment. That's okay. As long as they recognize what the role is, and as long as they recognize their limitations, as long as they can try to leverage other institutions to provide information and take action and so on, that's what coalitions are all about. But yes, no, there are coalitions. And if there are particular issues, I would suggest that you contact organizations like MALDEF, the CRLA, etc.
Okay, one has asked one last comment, and this is it, and then I'll wrap it up. That's it.
One thing that I think is helpful to other people that are considering running or trying to do something in their communities is to see successes in other communities. There's nothing like success to breed a desire to go even further. If nothing else, what we are doing here hopefully will serve as a model or an inspiration for other people to do likewise. Once you see it is possible, it makes you a little bit more inclined to try that bit harder in your community to make a go of it. And one point that hasn't been mentioned in this regard, with regard to the paper that was presented by Paola and by I'm sorry, it's my son's name, you'd think I'd remember it, is that there was an attempt to make a distinction between rural areas and urban areas. The paper started off by discussing that initially the attention was focused on what was going on with the farm workers in rural areas, that over time the attention of the academicians and other folks shifted to the urban areas, and now we're looking at what is the situation with regard to the rural areas again. I would like to suggest to you that it isn't fruitful to really make those artificial distinctions. I think, for example, here in Fresno, we have very much a regional situation where what we do in the city of Fresno affects what's going on in the communities around us. What happens in Orange Cove, what happens in Parlier, in turn provides inspiration for us here in Fresno, and it's very much a mutual relationship. It's a reciprocal relationship. It's a symbiotic relationship. We all need to move together, both rural and urban. Fresno is an urban area. It's surrounded by rural areas. There's no point making any bones about that. What happens here affects other people, is disseminated through the information sources, through Radio Bilingüe, through the newspapers. We're all in close contact with another, and what happens in each of our areas in turn makes it that much easier for the other areas to move an extra step forward.
I want to thank all of you for your patience and the panelists here for their presentations. And now, lastly, Carol Zubin is going to give us a few remarks on what to do next. So.
Actually, all I'm going to do is close the meeting and hope that this is the first step in a longer process, but I know we're all tired and we really appreciate all the energy everybody's put in. The program will continue contacting you informally or through, you'll hear about different things that we do. Please do fill out the evaluation form that's in your packet if you can, and either send it to us or give it to somebody out there. I want to thank especially the translators who've been working really hard all day. And just one last thing is, we we are having a dinner at the Waituri Basque Hotel, which is in downtown Fresno on Kern and P Streets. There's a map in your